Today we are talking about Book 6 in the Iliad. Let me call that up real quick, and we'll look at text, and we'll look at all sorts of other things. There's a lot packed in here in this book, and Book 6 is, boy, it's got a lot. So we'll see if we can get to as much as we can today. First thing to note is that Book 6 is going to, in this ongoing theme that we've been developing of chiasmus, Book 6 is going to be paralleling a book later on in the text. So if we look at the text itself here, this is Fegel's translation of Book 6, Hector Returns to Troy. We see here that Book 6 is going to parallel, if we count backwards, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20, Book 19, The Champion Arms for Battle. And part of the thing you can immediately say in this is that there's going to be a contrast between the character that we see of Hector in this book and the character that we see highlighted in Book 19, which is Achilles. The two are meant to be contrasted one with the other. The Achilles character is supposed to be set up as a foil against the Hector character and vice versa. Homer is guiding his readers, his audience, to see Hector as an honorable man, a good character. He's the hero of the story. So if we're going to consider Hector as the hero of the story, perhaps the first thing to do would be to consider, well, what do we mean by that term? What do we mean by a hero in a story? Let's turn to that first. A hero in the story, and we'll share this screen. The word itself, hero, comes from the Greek word heros, which is particularly, it says here, one such as Heracles with divine ancestry or later given divine honors. So in most classical texts, when we talk about heroes, we talk about Marduk or Gilgamesh or others, we're talking about heroes that have divine ancestry of some sort. That's kind of a key. Heroes later on, like Perseus, for instance, or we look at Bellerophon, we look at Theseus. These are all characters who are quasi-divine. They had divine blood in them. So that's a key element. And Homer does that to some extent, but it's not played up with Hector. So Hector does come from divine descent insofar as his father, Priam, the king of the city, is related distantly to gods, to godlike beings. So he does have some divine blood in him, so to speak, but that's not played up in the epic. So there's a departure here from the traditional hero in Homer, in that Hector is more human than he is divine. Now, according to the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, an authority, right? The Proto-Indo-European root is ser, to protect. According to Eric Partridge in Origins, the Greek word hieros is akin to the Latin servare in later, the U or W becomes a V sound. It means to safeguard. So Partridge concludes that the basic sense of both hera and hero would therefore be protector. Hera was a Greek goddess of many attributes, it says, including protection, and her worship appears to have similar Proto-Indo-European origins. So when we're talking about Hector as a hero in the story, he is the main protector. Now, something that this etymology leaves out is that hero also is a character that we are supposed to emulate. Villains or villains, which is a later word, of course, is a French word from medieval France. But villains are characters that we're not supposed to emulate. They're the bad guys, the black hats, the ones that go around breaking stuff and hurting people. And we're not supposed to be like that traditionally. Although the times are changing, and you see in some movies, maybe we're supposed to be more like the villains. But I reject that. And you should too, especially if you're reading Homer. In Homer, certainly, when we talk about heroes, we're talking about the noble types. And characters like Achilles are not the hero. Achilles is the protagonist, and that's different. Protagonist means the first sufferer. He is the one who suffers the most. And so the story will focus on him as he suffers, but it's not going to say, oh, be like Achilles. Not at all. So the first thing we notice that Hector is made out to be a hero in this story. Remember also that we've got various things that we're focusing on. We're focusing on the idea of rage, mania, and how that clouds the mind. And we're focusing on iconoclasm, how Homer's undercutting all these gods and pulling the feet out from under them. We're focusing on kleos and aristeia, kleos being the glory or nobility of a person, and aristeia being that moment when they shine in battle, especially. We're also looking at the Greek term of hubris, which is pride, especially overweening pride. The kind of pride that makes you think you are a god when really you are not. It's the whole subject of the metamorphosis later on. And that brings us to the last, which is metamorphosis. That's the alteration or change that a person has to undergo if they're going to become an adult. And in this story, Achilles, the protagonist, is the one who is suffering the most in order that he change and grow up from being a little runty guy to being actually somebody who is part of the human race. Okay. In terms of plot, basically, we've got Achilles who vows to leave the army after Agamemnon insults him. And that's his rage, right? That's his minion. And then you've got some fighting, and you've got Paris whisked away to his room filled with scent, where he shows himself to be quite the incontinent man. You got more carnage that goes on, and you've got a particularly interesting scene of Diomedes where he stabs Aphrodite, little tiny nick, and she goes running off to blubber to her mom. And then he stabs Ares later on, right? And that hurts Ares, guts pulling out, and he goes to see Zeus, and Zeus is like, I hate you. And so we've got that. That's where the plot is right now. So let's take a moment right now before we get into the actual plot of book 6. Let's look at Aphrodite and Ares briefly, and who are these characters? Because they figure prominently here, and they play a little bit of a role later on, though they are overshadowed by characters like Apollo and Athena and Hera further on. So the first one to look at is actually Aphrodite. Here's Aphrodite. She is the goddess, the Olympian goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, and procreation. Creating in pro. Notice it's the Olympian goddess. These gods and goddesses of Olympus, of Mount Olympus, they took over the rule from the predecessors, or before the gods before them, who were titanic gods, the Titans. And they had a big old war, Titanomachia. And basically Zeus hired these giants with lots of hands, and they hired one giant to make him thunderbolts. And he used the thunderbolts and the 100-handers, and they defeated the Titans using that power. So he basically won the arms race, and he took over the rule of heaven from those previous gods, the Titans. And he established a new pantheon called the Olympian gods, because they live on Mount Olympus, right? So yeah, makes sense. And these are the Olympians that we're referring to. So by the time that we get to Homer, we're talking about Olympian gods primarily, although there is some reference to earlier gods, titanic gods, etc., etc. Aphrodite is the goddess of love, beauty, and pleasure, as I said before. Now, I have made the distinction that she's actually the goddess of lust, which is a little bit different than love. So she has some interesting origin stories. Probably the most interesting and slightly off-color one is this one from Hesiod in his work Theogony. So he bowdlerizes some of the phrases, so you have to use your imagination. But it says here, hopefully you can see this. Let's see here, we'll blow it up a little bit. Boom, boom. Okay. Hesiod, Theogony. It says, Uranos, sky, came bringing on night and longing for love, and he lay about Gaia, the earth, spreading himself full upon her. And by the way, Uranos and Gaia, these are earlier gods. Okay, Gaia, the earth, is an earlier goddess, and Uranos is an earlier god as well. And their son, Kronos, is the Titan god. He's the guy that Zeus later has a battle with and kicks out. So this is 2 generations before the Olympians. So Uranos, who is the sky, and Gaia, who is the earth, they basically get married. They get hitched here. And it says Kronos sneaks in from his ambush, and he stretched forth his left hand, and in his right he took the great long sickle with jagged teeth and swiftly lopped off his own father's members and cast them away to fall behind him. He emasculates his father. Okay, you can work that out. Go ask your mother what that means. And basically chucks the remains of his poor carved up daddy behind him. And it says, so soon as he had cut off the members with flint and cast them from the land into the surging sea, they were swept away over the main a long time. And a white foam spread around them from the immortal flesh, and in it there grew a maiden. So all this white foam billows up from the ocean, and out comes a maiden. And first she drew near holy Kythera, and from there afterwards she came to sea-girt Cyprus, and came forth an awful and lovely goddess, and grass grew up about her beneath her shapely feet. Her gods and men call Aphrodite and Aphrodania, because she's born of the foam. Aphros is foam, Aphro is foam, and Jania is being born from that foam. Because she grew amid the foam and well-crowned Eustephanos, Cytherea, because she reached Cythera, and Cyprogenes, because she was born in billowy Cyprus, and Philomedes, genital loving, because she sprang from the members, and with her went Eros, and comely Himeros followed her at her birth at the first, as she went into the assembly of the gods. And this honor she has from the beginning, and this is the portion allotted to her amongst men and undying gods. The whisperings of maidens and smiles and deceits with sweet delight and love and graciousness. Well, the first thing you note here is that the ancients did not have a problem telling stories that were, shall we say, off color. And some of the origins of their gods and goddesses, as we see, were not always nice, and they weren't always even reasonable, as we saw with Leda and the swan. Prepare yourself, because there are quite a few more of these sorts of stories. One thing to note is that she is born, as it says, as an awful and lovely goddess, awful and lovely, because she's overpowering in her beauty. There's a great painting, I forget that, maybe Titian. This is called The Birth of Venus, and it's done during the Renaissance, right? And yet it captures something of the element. It was Botticelli. It captures something of the element that we're talking about here, which is this awfulness of the goddess, this power of the goddess. And she comes, as it says here, Venus on the half shell. She comes born into the world fully mature, as a full woman. And here she is, Botticelli's Venus on the half shell. And again, it's a Renaissance piece, but nevertheless, it gives you an idea of the birth of Venus. And perhaps the best image of this in a sort of comical way is from the movie Baron Munchausen, where she comes out of this shell that opens up, and behold, it's Uma Thurman. It's quite funny. So that's Aphrodite. And her brother and consort is this fellow here, Ares, who is the god of war. Now, Ares goes way back. I mean, he's a very old god. It says he is the Olympian god of war, battle lust, courage, and civil order. In ancient Greek art, he was depicted as either a mature, bearded warrior armed for battle, or a nude, beardless youth with a helm and spear. And we'll stick with the mature, bearded warrior one for now. Here's a picture of him on a vase, a pot, an urn. And his parents were Zeus and Hera. They got married, they got hitched. They had a kid, and that kid was violent. He was like a psychopath. And Ares is not the god of nice battle. He is the god of battle carnage and battle madness and reveling and guts and blood and all that kind of stuff. Even Zeus, as we see in our text, hates the guy, calls him, a lying, deceitful, dog-faced. He's not well liked. But in the ancient world, people said, combat was very terrifying, as always. It still is, but it was in the ancient world, it's terrifying because you're in a bucket. And you've got people next to you in buckets, and the sound is just raging around you, and you've got things flying every which way, and it's hot, and you don't know what's coming at you half the time. And there's a battle madness that comes on people. And they frequently would say, there were reports of people saying that they saw Ares in battle, like moving through the ranks of the soldiers. So terrifying. Ares was not a well-liked god, but he was definitely a god that was respected and worshipped. And there's a story about how he and Aphrodite got hitched to each other. She was apparently wedded to Hephaestus, the god of the forge. And Ares and she liked each other, and so they went out and they played patty cake together. And And they got caught by Hephaestus, and he embarrassed both of them publicly before the gods. And that story is told in Homer. So we'll see that maybe a little later. But anyway, these are the two gods that we're dealing with when we have Diomedes coming at the gods and stabbing the gods. And one might ask, how is it that Hephaestus and Venus or Aphrodite are hitched to each other? How is it they're romantically involved? One could say that the lust for carnal delight and the lust for battle are similar lusts. They overcloud the mind. They make you do stupid things. They drive you around. There's a sort of like temperature rise, like you get into a fury. So both of them are very closely related. But I think also that they're related, especially in the Homeric times, in that Aphrodite, it doesn't take much to make Aphrodite cruel and vindictive and warlike and vengeful. Anybody who has ever dated somebody of the opposite sex and caught the full brunt of their wrath during a breakup would probably concur that there is a lot of similarity between Aphrodite and Ares. And anybody who's been in battle and has experienced this rush, you don't have to be in battle, you could be in sports, heavy sports. The rush that occurs there is similar to an experience like love, like desire. So euphoric almost. So that kind of covers the ground of what we saw last time in the story. We saw Aphrodite and Ares both getting stabbed by Diomedes. And our book 6 picks up with a similar slaughter of Diomedes charging amongst the ranks and clash between the troops. And that basically it shows the clash between the two. And then you come across this really interesting scene where there's a begging scene with Menelaus and Agamemnon. And this is, what is this? It's a parallel to book 21, as we'll see later, though we're parallel in book 19. In this one, we see this character comes up and he begs Menelaus to not kill him. So says here, Adrestus, right? Menelaus caught Adrestus alive. Rearing, bolting in terror down the plain, his horses snared themselves in tamarisk branches. So he's tearing down the terrain, and his horses and the chariot get caught in some tangly branches. Splintered his curved chariot just at the pole's tip, and breaking free, they made a dash for the city walls, where battle teams by the drove stampeded back in panic. But the master hurled from the chariot, tumbling over the wheel and pitching face down in the dust, and above him now rose Menelaus. So he falls in the dirt and he's completely helpless, and Menelaus comes up behind him, ready to spear him. And Adrestus hugs his knees. This is a traditional thing where you grab the guy behind the knees, you put yourself at his service because your head is down and he can just chop you with one blow. And he says, "Take me alive, Atrides, take a ransom worth my life. Treasures pile up in my rich father's house, bronze and gold and plenty of well-wrought iron. Father would give you anything, gladly, priceless ransom, if only he learns I'm still alive in Argive ships." This is a traditional thing that, especially with wealthy families, that if you got caught in battle, you could ransom your life. You could say, "Take me prisoner. My family will pay you money, and I'll still be alive." And won't that be great? And so you see that happen quite frequently. But here you see it happening as a parallel, right? It's basically being parallel to something that happens in book 21, as we'll see later. Trying to choose like how much do I say without giving away plot. Achilles is faced with almost an identical choice. And the wording, as we see in book 21, the wording that we see is almost identical. It's almost like, "Take me alive, Achilles, take a ransom worth my life." Right? "Father would give you anything, gladly, priceless ransom." So Homer is repeating this little phrase of begging that this character here, Adrestus, gives to Menelaus. And what happens is that Agamemnon, because it says his pleas are moving the heart in Menelaus, just at the point of handing him to an aide to take him back to the fast Achaean ships. So Menelaus is like, "Yeah, that makes sense. I'll ransom you. I'll spare your life." And he's about to call an aide, "Come here and get this guy, take him back." When his brother shows up, right? Up rushed Agamemnon. Now remember, Agamemnon is he is the man who is driven by demons, basically, to try and get Helen back. Not Menelaus so much. It's more Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the one who's killed his own daughter in order to get this war underway. Agamemnon is the one who then is brutal, cruel. He loves his brother Menelaus, but he's a brutal man. And as we see later on, he meets a very brutal end. But we'll talk about that later. Agamemnon rushes up and he blocks his way, blocking the way of the guy being taken back to the ships. And he shouts out, "So soft, dear brother, why? Why such concern for enemies?" Because he doesn't see human and human. He sees enemies and us. Us and them, as Pink Floyd said, right? Us and them. Why are you so concerned for enemies? I suppose you got such tender, loving care at home from the Trojans. I would to God not one of them could escape his sudden plunging death beneath our hands. No baby boy still in his mother's belly, not even he escape. All Ilium blotted out. No tears for their lives, no markers for their graves. And that's brutal. It's supposed to be brutal. Homer is not, this is not just a throwaway little statement. This kind of embodies Agamemnon. He would eat the Trojans raw, you know. He is this savage, almost like animalistic character. And what we'll see in the parallel later on is that Achilles comes that close to being Agamemnon. I mean, he even says the same words. He says things like, rip the babies out of the mother's bellies, eat the Trojans raw, blot out all of Ilium, is what Achilles says later on. And Agamemnon brings his brother round. He basically convinces him, either because Menelaus doesn't want to stand up to his savage, raging brother, or because it makes sense. Why am I saving any of these guys? And Menelaus then shoved Adrestus back with a fist. Powerful Agamemnon stabbed him in the flank, and back on his side, the fighter went face up. The son of Atreus dug a heel in his heaving chest and wrenched the ash spear out. So they killed this guy in cold blood, even after he had surrendered, even after he had been granted a ransom. That's pretty cold. But it's supposed to be a stark image of what Agamemnon is like. And in some ways, it's a warning to us as readers, because we're supposed to be following this plot thread of Achilles. It's a warning to us that Achilles runs the risk of going this route. This is what he could become. Now, I want to highlight that because what happens next is the route that he might go, the opposite direction. It's the route of Hector, heroic Hector. And we have a whole series of things here that happen, some carvings up of various people. And Helenus then, this comes up, the son of Priam, so we switch to the Trojans. The son of Priam comes up, and it says, Helenus, son of Priam, best of the seers who scanned the flight of birds, came striding up to Aeneas and Hector. He's a priest, basically. And he says, my captains, so and so forth, go through the ranks, rally all the troops, hold back our retreating mobs outside the gates, keep people from rushing into the gates again, because we don't want them to, we don't want to be under siege. We want to be able to hold the army out here as much as possible. And he says, but you, Hector, you go back to the city. You are the captain of the armies. You go back to the city. And he tells him to go back and pray, which is really interesting. That, Hector, don't go back and counsel with the generals, but go back and pray to the gods. Hector, you go back to the city. Tell our mother, because they're brothers, right? Tell our mother to gather all the older noble women together in gray-eyed Athena's shrine on the city's crest. Unlock the doors of the goddess's sacred chamber and take a robe, the largest, loveliest robe that she can find throughout the royal halls, a gift that far and away she prizes most herself, and spread it out across the sleek-haired goddess's knees. And promise to sacrifice 12 heifers in her shrine, yearlings never broken, if only she'll pity Troy, the Trojan wives, and all our helpless children, if only she'll hold Diomedes back from the holy city, that wild spearman, that invincible headlong terror. And basically he's asking for mercy from the goddess who is directly opposed to Troy. Pray to Athena. Pray that she not attack our city. And to go back to this theme that Homer's developing, because he's developing a theme of undercutting the gods, iconoclasm, I'm calling it. This Athena that's depicted here, and to be quite frank, the one that's depicted in Homer's Odyssey, is not just a passive ghost that occasionally speaks to Odysseus. Athena in this story is not just some waif who's expressionless. She's a goddess who has a great deal of expression. She's very petulant. She's very fickle. In the Odyssey, she ends up being much more direct and blunt and abrupt, a kind of different character than here. But in this little bit, we have something of the terror of Athena, who she really is. We've seen the terror of Aphrodite back when Aphrodite threatens Helen. And both these goddesses are supposed to be beautiful. The perfection of femininity, emulating them would be a good thing. But Homer says, no, the opposite is true. Aphrodite is not a character we should emulate. She's horrifying. She's a slave driver. And here we've got Athena, who they're going to pray that she spare the city. She drive off the Achaeans and not encourage them. She spare the mothers and the helpless children. What we'll see is that Athena does the opposite. She doesn't listen to these prayers. Athena actually not only drives the forces of Achaia into the city, she does it with a terrifying subterfuge. That's later on. That's the Trojan horse. Okay. Athena's vicious, and she is filled with battle lust, like a lot of the gods. And again, that's part of the undermining here. But Helenus has encouraged Hector to go back to the city. And here is where we get probably I think that this is one of the greatest images of heroism in the story. It's really a great image of what a hero is supposed to be. It's a great image of the good and noble man. So yeah, it's a great scene. Before we get to that scene, we have another scene. Hector obeyed his brother start to finish. Down he leapt from his chariot, fully armed, hit the ground, and brandishing two sharp spears, went striding down his lines, ranging flank to flank, driving his fighters into battle, rousing grisly war, and round the Trojans whirled, racing to meet the Argives face to face. And the Argives gave way, and they quit the slaughter, and they thought some god slipped down the starry skies to back the Trojans. They wheeled and rallied so, and Hector shouted at his men in a piercing voice. So he rallies his troops, and then he turns for home. So first he encourages them to fight back the Achaeans from the gates of Troy, and then he turns and he goes home after his work is done. So that says something about his character. Now, remember that when we're judging a character, we're judging them by what they do, what they say, how they appear, and any signs or symbols that surround them. Okay, those things will contribute to our understanding of the character. If a character here knows that there's a problem, that is, the gates of Troy are going to get sacked, and he turns around and he does what's necessary in order to stop that, rallies the troops, we could say that's a noble guy. And then he goes back to the city to pray. That's a pious guy. So we have at least two things going for Hector here, really noble things. And then we get this really interesting little bit. And this has puzzled scholars for quite some time. Because right before we cut to, if you imagine a movie, before we cut to Hector going to the city, we have a scene where two characters meet each other on the field of battle. Diomedes meets Glaucus on the field of battle. And they pause in the middle of battle. They're about to attack each other, and they pause, and they give long speeches to each other. And then they shake hands, and they go home. Now, most of you would read that and say, what is this nonsense? This doesn't happen in battle. This is ridiculous that you would have two guys in full armor ready to kill each other, stop, and talk. Well, remember that this is, on the one hand, this is a verbal medium, and it's a piece of artwork. So, yeah, probably in real life this wouldn't happen. But what we call verisimilitude, that is the attempt to make something appear exactly as it would in real life, is not the main concern of the poet. The main concern of the poet here is to set up stories that balance one another in order to paint a full picture. So, yeah, they might not have stopped in battle and talked to each other, but it gives us the opportunity, on the one hand, to see that both sides are human, because the Trojan side, where you have Glaucus, and the Achaean side, where you have Diomedes, both these guys are seen as vicious warriors, and yet there's a human side to them, and they have a human moment one with the other. The other point is to bring up the story of Bellerophon, because that's what Glaucus says is my family line. So Diomedes opens up and says, "Who are you, my fine friend? Another born to die? You come here, I'm going to kill you? Is that what you came here on the field of battle? I'd like to know who I'm going to carve up first." And he says, "So who are you?" And Glaucus, the son of Hippolochus, says, "Why do you ask about my birth? We're about to fight. Why are you asking me this?" "Well, I'll tell you." And then he does. "Like the generations of leaves, the lives of mortal men." Little wonderful line there. Like the generations of leaves. We're like, we grow, we turn green, we turn brown, we fall, we die. Now the wind scatters the old leaves across the earth. Now the living timber bursts with the new buds, and spring comes round again. And so with men. As one generation comes to life, another dies away. It's a beautiful piece of poetry. But it's also supposed to spark in us a reflection here. We also are humans, and our experience is like leaves. We come into the green, we grow, and then we wither and we die. And that happens over and over and over again. And the pattern is a universal pattern. It's an immortal pattern, just like metamorphosis is an immortal pattern. And either we accept that pattern or we reject it, like Achilles, and claim godlike status. We are above the pattern. We're gods. And Glaucus here is accepting the pattern. He's saying, I'm part of this pattern, and I'm trying to find the pattern of my ancestors. I'm trying to follow the pattern of my ancestors. And my ancestor happens to be one Bellerophon. As he says, he refers to this city, right? Argos. And he goes into this long story about Bellerophon. So it says here, "So straight to the king she went, blurting out her lies. I wish you'd die, Proteus, if you don't kill Bellerophon. Bellerophon's bent on dragging me down with him in lust, though I fight him all the way." All of it falls. But the king seethed when he heard a tale like that. He balked at killing the man. He'd some respect at least. But he quickly sent him off to Lycia, gave him tokens, murderous signs, scratched in a folded tablet. Many of them, too, enough to kill a man. He told him to show them to Antaeus' father. That would mean his death. And so off he went to Lycia. So on and so forth, right? And that king ordered Bellerophon to kill the Chimera. So this king, not wanting to kill Bellerophon, says, "You go kill the Chimera. You're my buddy. We're buddies. Go kill the Chimera." The Chimera was a monster, three-headed monster, and nobody had been able to defeat it. It was a dragon and a lion and an eagle or something like that, and on a lion's body, and had wings and claws. It was terrifying. Nobody was able to kill it. And so Bellerophon killing the Chimera is a death sentence, right? So the king sends him off to die. That's essentially the story. And it says this character, this monster, was all lion in front, all snake behind, all goat between. Terrible, blasting, lethal fire at every breath. But he laid her low, Bellerophon. He laid her low, obeying signs from the gods. Then he fought the Silame, the tribesmen, and then for a third test, he brought the Amazons down. Not the company, by the way. As he turned back, his host spun out the tightest trap of all, picking the best men from Lycia far and wide. He set an ambush that never came home again, because Bellerophon killed them all. Then, yes, when the king could see the man's power at last, the true son of the gods, he pressed him hard to stay, and he offered his own daughter's hand in marriage, and he gave him half his royal honors as a king. He's like, "Oh, well, you killed all these things that were a good job. Be my son-in-law," because kings are terrified. And basically, Bellerophon has these kids, and one of them was Laodamia, and Laodamia lay with Zeus, and she bore the god a son, Sarpedon. And my ancestors, right? He goes down and down and down. I'm one of their kids, their grandkids. Okay, Hippolochus fathered me, I'm proud to say, and he sent me off to Troy. So I am the descendant from Bellerophon. That's basically me. And like Bellerophon, who faces Chimera, I'm here facing my enemies like a man does. So it's really interesting. You have this little scene. Well, it's a long scene. I suppose you could say it's kind of implausible that they would say these sorts of things on the field of battle. But what Homer is doing is he's setting up for us the contrast of these heroic characters, Bellerophon and the Chimera, and Glaucus and Diomedes as men, as adults who face the terrors that they're supposed to face, and not knowing if they're going to live or die. And that's what they do. They're not like Paris, who gets whisked away to his room full of scent. And they're not like Achilles, who quits the battle because he can't get his way. They're more like Hector. Hector is the kind of paragon of this. And this little vignette of Bellerophon is introduced in order to set us up to understand Hector better. As a quick side note, here's the little entry of Bellerophontes. And he's most famous, it doesn't say here in Homer, but he's most famous for having a pal in the winged horse by the name of Pegasus, as we see here. And there's Pegasus and Bellerophon fighting the Chimera. Because with Pegasus, he was able to fly out of the reach of the Chimera and his fire, and he would stoop back in and stab him, etc. And there's some great adaptations of this, by the way, which I would recommend. Look on Amazon. There are several of them. I'll put them in the line notes if I remember to. The point being is that this is a famous story. That on Bellerophon's power, he flies on a Pegasus and he kills this impossible to kill beast of the Chimera. So that sets us up then to be able to understand what's going on with this character of Hector. Hector, you'll notice, or as I said before, he's the heroic character, and as you'll notice, there's something that frequently happens with Hector, what's called a Homeric epithet. This Homeric epithet is Hector of the shining helmet. And you'll see that come up over and over again throughout the course of the story. Hector of the shining helmet. Hector of the shining helmet. And part of this is supposed to stand out even during the time of Homer, because Homer's writing about an era 400 years in the past called the Bronze Age, which ended sometime around 1200 BC. And Homer's writing in 800, so at least 400 years before the end of the Bronze Age. And the sack of Troy is about 1250, so it's 450 years. So he's writing about something which he didn't know a great deal about. But he did know something of the way weapons and war worked. And he knew that the weapons that people carried were normally leather and whatever weapon, the spear, they could get arrows. And if you were wealthy, you had bronze. And if you were noble, you had bronze. That's one thing. Well, what is bronze? We might ask, especially because we don't see it as much. We don't know that we see it as much. So let's take a look at that real quick. Bronze is an alloy, first off. An alloy is a combination of two metals. And bronze is the combination of tin and copper with some other metals added, as it says here. And the Bronze Age was an era that lasted all the way up until roughly 1200, when it ended quite suddenly due to some unknown factor, though it's suspected it was due to a group of people that attacked called the Sea Peoples. And it's still used today in some things. But this alloy was essentially something that became ubiquitous in the Mediterranean for weapons and other things. And it's all very well and good to say it was an alloy, but then you got to ask, well, where did they get the stuff? Where did the copper and the tin come from? Mainly, when we look at the map of this area, remember this area here, right there is where Troy is. This area here of the Mediterranean, and then Greece over here, was primarily on the sea trade routes that go to the east, but also sea trade routes that go to the west. And there's a lot of trade overland too, surprisingly. So when we look at the map of tin mines Tin is all over the place. These are the green sites here. And major tin deposits were here in Spain. Major tin deposits were over here in the east. And so you had tin all over the place. There were tin objects here, and tin was found all over the joint. So that was not something that was hard to come by. Tin was not hard to come by. But you can't make weapons out of tin. Anybody who's worked with tin before, it's a very soft metal, very pliable. And if you had a sword made out of tin, it would not do well when you're trying to slice something. Copper, on the other hand, added to tin makes a stronger metal, and it makes a shinier metal. And copper, as it says here, naturally occurs as native metallic copper. It was known to some of the oldest civilizations on record. The history of native copper use dates to 9000 BC in the Middle East, so it goes a long way back. And a native copper pendant was found in northern Iraq that dates to 8700 BC. Evidence suggests that gold and native meteoric iron were the only metals used by humans before copper and hot metallurgy, which is the combining of metals using heat. The history of copper metallurgy is thought to follow this sequence. First came cold working of native copper, then annealing, followed by smelting, and finally casting. Copper is a little harder to come by. And I asked the question, actually, of Reddit to see what they had to say. And here's what they came up with. And hopefully you can see this. Copper is one of the few native metals that are metals that occur in concentrations of a pure element. If you walk around the right place, you'll eventually stumble upon a hunk of copper lying partially exposed on the ground. This copper will have the traditional verdigris, which is green color like the Statue of Liberty. We can't know for certain as copper predates written history, but we theorize that somebody found this pretty green rock and hit it with another rock. Copper is relatively soft, so in ancient times they would have found that if you work carefully and get a bit lucky, you can beat a hunk of native copper into a decorative or useful shape. Native copper is generally formed around volcanic areas. The copper begins mixed in water below the surface. As this water is heated, it moves through vents toward the surface. The copper begins to collect along the walls of these vents, and eventually you have a long copper vein. If the formation with the native copper is weathered bits might fall off and you get the hunk of copper I talked about in the earlier paragraph, nearby you are likely to find a wall of some kind, that same telltale green color showing some spots. And then you follow the vein. As you probably know, copper is a good conductor of heat. The rocks around it are not so much so. At some point, people discovered that you could build fires at the start of a vein, and the heat would travel along the copper, heat it, causing it to expand and break the rock around it. This allowed ancient people to mine copper from rock that might otherwise have been too hard to mine with stone or bone tools. Natural copper occurs throughout the world. There's no single source for the copper that created the Bronze Age. Interestingly, the copper was the easy part of the Bronze Age. Bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. Copper and tin rarely exist in the same area. Perhaps the single most important factor in creating the Bronze Age was trade routes. Somebody had to find copper, somebody had to find tin, and then they had to be brought together to make bronze. Bringing these elements together required development of complex systems of trade. And as we said earlier, this is probably why the Trojan War occurred, was in order to get hold of the trade route of copper and tin and other things. And then somebody added, it is possible to make bronze without tin. Just add arsenic or find some copper that's naturally contaminated with arsenic. Unfortunately, smelting this ore gives off arsenic, which is pretty poisonous. The Greeks made a lot of arsenic bronze. They also noticed that a lot of their smiths were having neurological problems. This is probably why Hephaestus is often depicted as lame, because of neurological problems brought on from arsenic that tinged the copper. Isn't that interesting? Well, this copper stuff put together with tin would be brought together to make bronze. And one of the great copper mines of antiquity was actually in, of all places, Wales. The great copper mine at Orme. It began around 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age, so about 2000 BC. The copper or malachite was mined using stones and bone tools. Estimated that up to 1,760 tons of copper was mined during the period. It was most productive in the period between 1700 and 1400 BC. The site was so productive that by 1600 BC, there were no other copper mines left open in Britain because they could not compete with the Great Orme Mine. So the Great Orme Mine was probably one of the primary sources of copper, and they shipped that stuff out to the Mediterranean over the trade routes, and that copper combined with tin made bronze. Well, all this goes back to an element of Hector of the shining helmet. And we know that the armor of the time period was of a specific type because we have pictures of it. They took pictures of it. Their armor was on pottery. And although the faces look a little silly here, the armor gives us, the picture gives us a good idea of what the armor looked like. And so that combined with archaeological digs that actually have pieces of this ancient armor, as here, gives us an idea of what this armor looked like. It was plate, large plates that were welded onto leather, perhaps maybe linen of some kind. And you had a helmet over the top. And you had a gorget that would be in the front to protect your neck. That doesn't look too terribly impressive because the copper has deteriorated over time. But if you can imagine it redone or reconstructed, polished up, if you will, it might look a little bit like this, which is a reconstruction of this armor. And this armor would gleam. In the sun especially, it would gleam. And it would be very expensive because, of course, the shipping and the forging of the alloy and then the shaping of the armor, that would cost a pretty penny. And so anybody who wore a plate set like this would be wealthy. They'd have to have noble status in order to wear this sort of stuff. And even then, look at their helmet, because that's not bronze. Now, bronze helmets did exist. I mean, we do have some samples of bronze helmets as we have samples of bronze swords. But the bronze helmets are rare. The more likely, most people had cloth helmets that were reinforced. So as another angle of this same armor, they'd have cloth helmets that were reinforced, or they might have some sort of wood or some kind of tooth on this. So they have boar's teeth that might be sewed onto the helmet. And then you get a helmet that looks a little bit like this fellow is wearing here. And the horns, some are depicted with horns, some without. One way or the other, it was mostly this that would block the blows of an enemy against the head. But the problem you might see immediately is that boar's teeth and cloth and even wood, they don't shine, they don't gleam. What that implies is that Hector had a bronze helmet. It gleamed in the sun. His full panoply might have looked something like this. This is a rendition, artist's rendition. And it would have gleamed in the sun, bright, shining color, and almost like looking at a mirror on the battlefield. And that's all well and good in terms of verisimilitude, because we're saying, okay, well, this makes sense that he would have this because he was wealthy. But more to the point is that Homer is making a point about the character himself. It's a lot like looking at an icon, later icon in Russian iconography. If you've ever seen an icon, the character has around him a gleaming nature, or a bronze nature, if you will. And it's as though he is gleaming in the sun. We call that a halo. He's no saint, Hector, but the same type of iconography exists as far back as Babylonian or earlier mythology. They have characters that have a gleaming glow around their head or around their body. So let's see if I can get iconography. This image of Christ, for instance, Christos Pantocrator. And by the way, I'm not saying that Hector is Christ, but Christos Pantocrator, famous icon. You'll see that around the head of Christ is this halo. And the halo is bronze color, gold color. Now that's to depict his divinity. But this same imagery goes farther back, way back in in history. So when we see Hector with the shining helmet, part of that is verisimilitude, because he probably had a bronze helmet. But another part of that is that he is the paragon or the paradigm. He's the hero. And the bronze helmet, the shining helmet, the flashing helmet, is in order to show what kind of man he actually is, where he is, he's the hero, right? He's the guy we're supposed to emulate. So that being said, we get in this section images of his gleamingness, if you will. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to share this instead. Here's the text. Hector's gleamingness. He obeys the commands, the signs from the gods, and he moves into the city, and the first person that he encounters, Hector, first person that he encounters, is his mother. It says, and now Hector reached the Scion gates and the great oak. The wives and daughters of Troy came rushing up around him, asking about their sons and brothers. And Hector just says, pray to the gods. Kind of grim. And he meets his mother there at the walls of the palace. And his mother met her son, Laodice, the loveliest daughter Hecuba ever bred. His mother clutched his hand and urged him, my child, why have you left the bitter fighting? Why have you come home? Look how they wear you out, the sons of Achaia. Curse them battling round our walls. And that's why your spirit brought you back to Troy to climb the heights and stretch your arms to Zeus. But wait, I'll bring you some honeyed, mellow wine. First, pour out cups to Father Zeus and the other gods, and then refresh yourself if you like to quench your thirst. So she offers to bring him refreshment, wine, because a mother always wants to concern herself with her kids. And Hector's immediate response is, I can't take wine because it would dull my head in battle. You'd sap my limbs and I'd lose my nerve for war. And I'd be ashamed to pour a glistening cup to Zeus with unwashed hands. One of the distinguishing marks about this character, Hector, is the mark of shame. He does things or doesn't do things because of the shame that would be involved. He does them because of the honor that would be involved. And he's a man who is bound by honor. So in this scene, it's showing other men would refresh themselves immediately and they'd jump at the chance and they would not restrain themselves. He shows great restraint and he doesn't accept this refreshing, cool, Gatorade or whatever it is, wine, because he knows that will just make him weak and he can't go back to war fuzzy-headed and weak. He says, no, you go and pray. Go to Athena's shrine and pray for us. We are desperate. And do all these things word for word that was told, appeal to Athena. Maybe she'll listen to us. And so she does. And there's a little scene where she does exactly what he tells her. And she goes and she makes supplication to Athena. But then it says, Athena refused to hear the prayers, right? And while they prayed to the daughter of mighty Zeus, Hector approached the halls of Paris. So he goes up and he visits Paris, his brother. And there he sees Paris basically in his room filled with scent. And it says, there in the bedroom, Hector came on Paris, polishing, fondling his splendid battle gear, his shield and breastplate, turning over and over his long curved bow. There's a contrast, right? Hector, man of war, covered in grime, ready to go back out into battle and do his duty. Paris, sitting around on a couch in a bathrobe, polishing beautiful unused weapons and gear. He's waxing his Ferrari. That's what he's doing. And there's a contrast between the two men. Paris, no, don't be like that guy. Hector, yes, be like this guy. Okay. And even Helen of Argos is sitting here with the women, weaving, right? She's weaving, which is a noble aspiration for women in Homer's time. But seeing Paris, Hector rakes him with words that, what on earth are you doing? You're a disgraceful guy. Get out there and get back to war. Everybody's counting on you. The city's going to fall apart and people are going to die. And you sit here fondling your bow? What kind of man are you? Get out there. And Paris, of course, oh yeah, I'm tall. I'm just that kind of guy. Oh, I just can't help myself. And so eventually he goes back out to battle. And then Hector, notice, helmet flashing, doesn't answer him. But Helen speaks up and she asks him, basically, she said, I'm a terrible woman. I wish I'd never been dragged here and so forth. But she says, come and rest. She asks him, come and sit, rest. Okay, take your rest. Don't go back into battle. Don't fight. I'm not worth it. And then Hector doesn't acknowledge her, doesn't say yes to her, doesn't even say no. He just turns to go. And he says, don't ask me to sit beside you. Love me as you do. You can't persuade me now. My heart races to help the Trojans, and they long for me sorely whenever I'm gone. But Rouse asks this fellow over here, get this guy off his couch, okay? Take care of Paris at least. Jeez, what a man. And I have to go back to see my own wife, not you, even though you're gorgeous. So he exercises restraint, right? He wants to get back into battle in a noble way. He doesn't let himself get entangled with wine, and he doesn't let himself get entangled with this gorgeous woman who is his brother's wife. Instead, he goes and he visits his own wife. And he has Andromache, wife of Hector. Andromache is a really interesting character. She's parallel to Penelope in the Odyssey. Same kind of grit and determination and sort of a person you can rely on. And she's beautiful, but she's also got this do-it-yourself kind of attitude where she's not just going to sit around and take it. So she goes down with her son to the gates to see what's going on. And when Hector goes to look for her, he asks, where is he? Where is she? I got to see my wife. And they all tell him she's down there. And so he goes to find her. And as he's going down to the Scion gates, which is the main gates, there he finds her. And the description of her is warm, generous wife came running up to meet him because she hears that he's coming down. Rumor, people tell her. And she goes running up to meet him. So a very different contrast to Paris and Helen. And Andromache, it says, it gives a little bio here. She says to him this heart-wrenching speech, don't go back to battle. You're going to die. And I can't stand that, basically. She says, reckless one, my Hector, your own fiery courage will destroy you. Have you no pity for him, our helpless son, or me, and the destiny that weighs me down, your widow, now so soon? Soon they will kill you off, all the Achaean forces massed for assault, and then bereft of you, better for me to sink beneath the earth. What other warmth, what comforts left for me once you have met your doom? Nothing but torment. I have lost my father, mother is gone as well, right? Achilles killed my father, little tie there. Achilles killed my father. He killed Ixion, stripped his gear. Okay, I had 7 brothers within our halls. All in the same day went down to the house of death. The great godlike runner Achilles butchered them all, tending their shambling oxen and shining flocks. So here we see that Achilles has killed her entire family. And now she's left with nothing, right? Nothing at all. She even says that to him. And she begs him, don't go back to battle. You're my father, my noble mother, a brother too, and you are my husband, young and warm and strong. Pity me, please. So there's this intense romance between the two. And Hector he's tempted to stay, but he says, I can't. And here's why. All this weighs on my mind too, dear woman, but I would die of shame to face the men of Troy and the Trojan women trailing their long robes if I should shrink from battle now a coward. See, shame and honor drive this guy, right? I would not do the shameful thing because I don't want that. I will do the honorable thing. And then he says, it's not just that, right? Even all that stuff. I know, right? I know that the day will come when sacred Troy must die. It's inevitable that our city's going to fall. I know that, but I will fight to the very end, even though I know that the end's going to come. And he says, that's not the thing that really kills me. Says that is nothing beside your agony when some brazen Argive hails you off in tears, wrenching your away your day of light and freedom. Then far off in the land of Argos you must live, laboring at a loom and another woman's beck and call. And he says, no, let the earth come piling over my dead body before I hear your cries, hear you dragged away. You see, at the very kernel of it, Hector is fighting not just for honor, not just to avoid shame. He's not fighting for plunder. He's not fighting for his own glory. He's fighting to protect the woman and the boy that he loves, fighting for his family. And that essence of nobility, I find it remarkable. That essence of nobility that Homer depicts here is remarkable because you don't actually find this in other stories. In other stories, heroes fight to protect the city, for nobility, for fame, for glory, for plunder. Sometimes they fight for honor or they fight to avoid shame. Very seldom do you have them fighting for love. Romance is a thing that is almost unknown in the ancient world. It doesn't exist in almost any of the literature. There are really only two sources that talk about romance at all. One is the Iliad in the person of Hector, and one is the Odyssey and the relationship between Odysseus and Penelope. Every other source, the hero does heroic things for other reasons. But here we find Hector fights to save the woman he loves. Beautiful scene. And it's followed by an even more poignant scene in some ways, because he then, having made this statement to her, he has the little boy brought out to him. Osteonyx. I mean, he's been there the whole time with the nurse, but the boy recoiled when Hector reaches down for him because he sees his shining helmet, right? The thing that makes him glorious, his fame, his kleos, his saintliness. It scares him. And he screams out at the sight of his father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge, the helmet nodding, bristling terror. And his loving father laughed, and his mother laughed as well, and glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, kissed him, tossed him in his arms, and lifting a prayer to Zeus and the other deathless gods. It's just a beautiful scene, right? He sets aside his glory. That's not the thing I'm concerned about. It's this little boy. And then he blesses him and he tosses him in the air and they have a family moment, laughing together. And he says to Zeus, I hope that my son is better than his father when he comes home from his battle wearing the bloody gear of the mortal enemy he's killed in war, a joy to his mother's heart. And that's basically the end, because he goes back and then you get Paris jumping back like a gazelle down. Oh, it's going to be a battle. Yeah, I'm in for it. I'm going to fight. And that's the end of the book, basically. But that last scene, that poignant little scene, it's made all the more poignant because you know the end of the story. At least the audience of Homer knows the end of the story. Now, Hector, who is a man who at the core is human first and warrior second. He is human. He loves his wife and his little boy, and that's what he fights for. And he fights to keep them both alive. And what later stories tell us is that he dies and they die too. Everybody in Troy dies or is sold off to slavery. And the fate of little Osteonyx, little Scamandrius, is quite terrible because he's at the advice of Odysseus. He is thrown off the walls of the city to his death. Knowing that adds to this scene a certain agony, a certain humanity and tragedy, which is truly remarkable in this story. And in some ways, I would contend that that agony, that tragedy, is part of the metamorphosis. Because if, as a reader, dear listener, if it strikes you in the feels, when you realize that this little boy is going to be thrown to his death on the jagged rocks, and you see this little scene before that and the humanity of that scene, and if you get a little verklempt, then you're one step away from being the selfish child concerned only about your own fate, and one step forward towards being a human being that cares about other human beings, regardless of whether they're family or the enemy, as Agamemnon would call them. Well, I think that's enough for today. We'll call it quits, and next time we'll charge into book 7, and we'll talk about Menelaus's Aristeia, his finest hour, and all that entails. I thank you very much for joining me for this excursion, and I hope it was helpful to you. If you have a question or comment, please leave it in the comments below. And do check out my Patreon site. And if you want to become a member, become a member. I'd love to have you on board. It sure would be a boost in the old and the old jowls for me if you did that for me. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next week when we tackle the next text. So long then.